Again, again, this is Mark Haynes, the research coordinator for Longleaf Alliance, and I'm also a research associate with Auburn University. I'm going to take just a minute to step back and talk about why we have this webinar today. It's estimated prior to European settlement there was about 90 million acres of longleaf pine, and by the mid-1990s we are down to about 3 million acres. And much of the longleaf that remains was in a fairly degraded condition from prior conversion to agriculture, in some cases intensive site preparation, and long-time exclusion of fire. So the longleaf pine ecosystem has always been recognized as an incredibly diverse forest, one of the most diverse in North America, in the herbaceous layer, the shrub layer, the native hardwoods that produce a ton of food for our native pollinators, our game, and our non-game species. So if it's native to the southeast, you can find breakfast, lunch, and supper out in that longleaf pine ecosystem. But as we converted it to other forest types, and in many cases we did intensive site preparation, and a lot of my work has focused on artificial regeneration of longleaf pine, including site preparation. When you go from 90 million acres down to 3 million acres, then you don't have the option of using natural regeneration on the remaining 87 million acres. And there's a lot of people interested in getting that forest back. A lot of our work is focused on how to be successful, and in many cases we used intensive site preparation, whether it was in mechanical or herbicide site prep. Often the goal was to take everything that was green and make it brown, and by removing many of those potential competitors, you maximized or minimized competition for water, nutrients, and lights. You focused on the tree. You maximize growth. That's a great way to grow a lot of wood, and it's a terrible way to manage a native forest or ecosystem if you have multiple resource values. And I would go so far as to say probably the majority of people who are planting longleaf pine today have multiple resource values. They want a very attractive forest that maintains a high population of game, and often even interested in the non-game species, which are totally dependent, again, on that native plant diversity that you'd find in a longleaf pine ecosystem. So where we knocked out a lot of that native diversity, landowners who wanted high deer, turkey, and quail populations were also often forced to use food plots. We often had tree nurseries and biologists who promoted exotic Asian species for these food plots. And they have become long-term management nightmares in many cases. So getting back to why we're doing this webinar today, one of the most important things we're going to be doing is focusing on recognition of our native plants and the values that they have, especially in relation to wildlife food sources. I think one of the most important things we do as a nonprofit through the Longleaf Alliance is our training to these Longleaf Academies, the 101 Academies. The 201 just finished up yesterday here at the Solon-Dixon Forestry Education Center in Andalusia, Alabama. And one of the lines I really love to hear is foresters and land managers say, I've spent my entire career looking up, and now I'm looking down at my feet, because it's down in that herbaceous layer and shrub layer that really drive these native plant populations and animal populations. So we're going to, in this webinar, also talk about ways we can modify our site preparation where we're restoring longleaf so that we can keep the species we want to keep, and get rid of those that we want to minimize or eliminate. We're going to talk some about restoration, whether we might use plants or seedlings or seed and the various techniques, just a little bit on availability, where we can get them. And we're going to point out some additional reading and resources. In the previous webinar, we suggested that some of you can consider getting Forest Plants of the Southeast and the Wildlife Uses by Miller. Miller is really one of the best, I think, books out there that you don't have to have a botany background. You never have to have taken a botany class to flip through this book and have excellent quality photographs of the many herbaceous and shrubby species, not necessarily the large hardwoods, but the herbaceous and the shrubby species of the Southeast and their wildlife values, written again by Jim Miller, the first author. I've known and worked with him for about 2 decades now in crossing circles, and he's probably one of the, if not the leading invasive species person in the Southeast, and he's also a fantastic nature photographer put together many of the photos in this book. He's also one of the very few people I've ever heard give an impassioned reading of a plant description at our Longleaf Alliance Regional Conference shortly after this book came out. Let's go directly to one of the invasive species that's utilized in many food plots today. Still millions of sawtooth oak being planted across the southeast. Latin is Quercus acutissima, so it's the same genus as all of our native oaks, and we have dozens of native oaks here in the southeast. Is it an exotic species? And it is an exotic species. It's from Asia. Is it invasive? The answer is yes, it is invasive. We have some some sawtooth oak that were planted on the Dixon Center here in Covington County, sandy coastal plain site. Very typical of much of the longleaf pine range. These were planted about 20 to 25 years ago. And now if we go out into this stand, and if I can get my marker to work here. Let's see. Here we go. No. There we go. That's a sawtooth oak seedling. That's a sawtooth oak seedling. This is a sawtooth. This is a sawtooth. Over here in the corner is another one. So what we are finding is we have hundreds, in some cases thousands of stems per acre coming up beneath these trees. If we go out in, this is an adjacent loblolly pine plantation that was thinned just 2 or 3 years ago. Didn't really recognize that there was sawtooth in the understory, but everything you see right here is advanced regeneration of sawtooth oak out in that loblolly plantation. So this is the sandy coastal plain site where we are seeing the sawtooth oak seedlings move out into the loblolly pine plantation. We have found some seedlings up to about 150 yards away from these trees. So it is, if we are going to continue planting it, it is going to become a part of our forest. There are some excellent alternatives. Instead of planting sawtooth that produce acorns in a fairly short run, I borrowed these slides from one presentation recently given by Carol Denhoff, our understory coordinator. Ones that a lot of biologists are familiar with are what we call the native runner oaks and the myrtle oak, Quercus pumila, myrtlefolia. These are ones you're going to find in the lower coastal plain, oftentimes on very sandy, low nutrient soils. The Quercus pumila is generally a few feet tall. Sometimes this is also called, I think, sand live oak. There's a photo, and here's the Quercus myrtlefolia, also called the scrub oaks. They produce acorns very early in the year, generally a month or two ahead of the more tree-like or larger oaks of the longleaf pine ecosystem. They've been documented as food sources, important food sources for deer, turkey, black bear, squirrel, and numerous other wildlife species. And now we're starting to see quite a few of the native plant tree nurseries are starting to produce the native scrub and runner oaks. So these might make some very good alternatives, especially to the sawtooth oak in the lower coastal plain. There are oaks that we have too much of. They're good examples of the laurel and the water oak, our primary invasive oaks that are really adapted to lower, wetter sites. And if you take fire out of this forest, which has happened across most of the natural longleaf pine range, then we get the rapid invasion of the off-site oaks, the laurel, the water. In some cases it's the live oak. There's several other species that you would expect to find down on lower, wetter sites, but they really should not be much of a component on our upland longleaf pine sites. And if we're going to convert that back to the longleaf pine forest, then we're generally going to have to do an intensive chemical site preparation. On most of these sites, if it has a severely degraded understory that we're not looking to protect, it's going to be an invasive based. We're going to be going in with high rates of arsenal or chopper. And if it's a sandier site where we're mainly targeting, again, the oak species, perhaps we have some grasses or native legumes that we want to keep out there, then we would probably go with the hexagonal site preparation, which would take out these invasive oaks, but maybe leave some of our more important plant and understory communities, at least portions of them, in place. We see longleaf restoration taking place on some huge scale, oftentimes on military bases, on state lands. in some cases on private land where they're restoring hundreds or thousands of acres at a time, and oftentimes they're doing broad-scale broadcast application of herbicides and eliminating all of the scrub oaks. And we think that's probably a mistake, especially if you're looking at managing a forest for wildlife and aesthetics, because the native scrub oaks are natural components of the longleaf ecosystems. Especially on the left we have here post oak, on the right is blackjack. Some other really good producers of oak mast in the longleaf pine ecosystem include the sandpost or Quercus margarita, the turkey oak, the bluejack oak, etc. These are all components of the longleaf pine ecosystem, and if you remove them on a broad scale, then you've eliminated most of your hard mass production. And we've seen sites that did support at one time fairly high populations, for instance the fox squirrels, and eliminated all of the scrub oaks, and the fox squirrel populations were severely diminished. These are also going to be important mass producers for deer and turkey, which are the primary game animals of the southeast. And when you keep a diversity of your scrub oaks out in that forest, you'll find that one year the turkey oak make, the next year the bluejack, and the next year might be the blackjack oak. What you'll find is if you keep some diversity of these large native scrub oaks, you're going to have some mass production almost every year. So you might want to consider mapping out and keeping some of these large scrub oaks in your forest, and not doing a broadcast application which would eliminate them. Maybe you would do some injection or use some non-soil active herbicides around these in your efforts to restore the longleaf pine ecosystem. Another species that we typically think of as a wet site species, but you'll find it on some of the driest sandhill sites. It's fairly invasive in the absence of fire, but if you use regular fire, you can keep it in place. You've got some fire shadows. You'll often find the black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. It's one of our most attractive species. We don't have a lot of fall color in the native longleaf pine ecosystem, but if you have some black gum out there, you can have some just amazing fall color ranging from purples to reds to yellows to oranges, and it produces a seed that is among some of our most important soft mass production on the longleaf pine ecosystem. Reading a brief passage from Forest Trees, A Guide to the Eastern United States by Lisa Samuelson and Michael Hogan. Some of the species that utilize black gum, including the white-tailed deer, they browse on the foliage. I've been down in swamps of South Louisiana when you had giant old black gums that were hollow. These are important den trees for bears. The fruit is also eaten by a wide variety of songbirds and game birds, including the northern bobwhite, the wild turkey, the ruffed grouse, the red-cockaded woodpecker, wood ducks, and the fruit is also eaten by a variety of mammals, including the black bear, the fox, the gray squirrel, the gray fox, the opossum, raccoon, and it goes on from there. And of course, the bee people recognize the black gum as one of the more important pollen producers that makes a really well-known the black gum or Nyssa-based honey. So this is one I wouldn't go out of my way to eliminate. You just want to keep it basically in check on your longleaf pine forest. But I remember reading a passage from Leon Neal where they would go out of their way to keep black gums out in the longleaf pine forest just as a scattered tree, but not as a dominant species. Another important very important wildlife producer. This is from the family Ebonaceae, and basically a monotypical species. About the only species I think in that family in the southeast is the native Persimmon Diospyros of virginiana. It's another one that gives us some really attractive fall color. It grows to very large size in the bottomland hardwoods, but it can make a decent tree on our longleaf pine ecosystems. It's one that I certainly wouldn't go out of my way to eliminate. We don't want 1,000 stems per acre, but it doesn't hurt to have 5 or 10 big fruit-producing persimmon among our longleaf pine ecosystems. This is one of the species that I've seen where you had food plots in cultivation in the longleaf pine forest. If you abandon those food plots, the majority of them you'll see persimmon sprouts coming up that very first year out of cultivation. And it's a dioecious species. That means there's some trees are all male flowers and some are all female. If you select out, for instance, take a food plot, take it out of production, and keep track of your female persimmon trees and maybe do a little fertilization, you're going to have a lot of great fruit production right there without going to the trouble of planting any tree species. Another exotic species that we're starting to find popping up across the southeast, it's been out there for a while, but it's becoming extremely problematic on our heavier soils, is the mock or trifoliate orange. Latin on it is Poncirus trifoliata. It's invasive. On loamy sands, we have pastures right here in Covington County that are being taken over by the mock orange. It's a very brutal species to try to get to. It has large thorns that'll really do a job on you. We've also seen it taking over huge tracts of land in a black belt of the heavier soils of central Alabama, where there are some places 40 and 80 acre, essentially forest of the mock orange. Have even seen it in bottomland hardwood sites over on the wildlife refuge in Louisiana. So it's a very variable as to the site requirements. It can grow almost anywhere. Often used as a rootstock for citrus. So if you have old abandoned orange or lime plantations that have been killed by hard freezes, the root systems may come back in solid mock or trifoliate orange. It has been promoted as a food plot species because the wildlife do eat the fruits. The trade-offs I certainly don't think are worth it in creating a forest that you can't walk through, but the wildlife do utilize the fruits. Another book we recommended again in the first presentation and would recommend again now is Non-Native Invasive Plants of the Southern Forest, again by Dr. Jim Miller with the U.S. Forest Service, and they have some recommended control measures, what herbicides, what mechanical means, in some cases that you may use to control the various invasive species of the southeast. And it will have recommendations, numerous recommendations in place for how to get rid of mock orange, including glyphosate, which is the active ingredient. Yeah, that's correct, Bob. I need to get that newer version in my presentation. There is one that combines the two previous editions. But glyphosate is active ingredient in Roundup at a 25% solution. If you can basically achieve total coverage of the foliage, you can knock it pretty good. Garlon 3A is a 25% solution. Again, that would work as a foliar application or cut stem treatment. The basal sprays include Pathfinder, which you don't need to mix. It's already got the triclopyr right in there, along with the surfactant or adjuvants that will cause it to penetrate the stem. Garlon 4 is a 20% solution. Stalker is a 6 to 9% solution. And again, here's your foliar treatments. Most of those are fairly safe to use beneath existing trees, such as longleaf or even your hardwoods. The one that you'd want to be the most careful with would be the Arsenal AC at 0.5% solution, because you're almost certainly going to get some on the soil and get some uptake. If you wanted to choose a native alternative that had thorns, most similar to the mock orange, the Hawthornes would be a fantastic place to start. Miller & Miller says that we have 56 species of hawthorn in the southeastern United States, and there's only 2 or 3 that I can identify. One that I think we have here is a Crataegus uniflora, or sandhills Crataegus. You're going to find it on some very, very poor sandy sites that are typical of upland longleaf pine ecosystems. It does fairly well even with frequent fire. It comes back from the root systems and produces a lot of seed. You're going to find from the driest site with the Crataegus uniflora, if you go down into the wettest sites of South Georgia, around their ephemeral ponds, you'll find the Mayhaw hawthorn. And that is the one that the fruits fall onto the water, they scoop it up, and they make the relatively famous Mayhaw jelly. So again, there's a tremendous variety of native Crataegus species out in the longleaf pine ecosystems, and they are considered excuse me, a fair to medium browse for deer. Some of the game birds that utilize the fruit include the ruffed grouse and the turkey. And some of the game animals that utilize it include the raccoon, the squirrel, the cottontail, and the deer. And there were just a bunch of birds that eat the fruits off these because they generally keep the fruit well into the winter months. Some examples that we cite are the cardinals and blue jays. Another native alternative that doesn't have thorns, I would call this kind of the consummate fence row species, is the native sumac. This is in the family Anacardiaceae, which we would call the sumac family, but if you're from South America, you might call it the cashew family, which is also in the Anacardiaceae. And growing up on a farm, I remember our fence rows, we would have the sumac would start coming in, and Grandpa and Dad thought it was just terrible because here's a brush species coming in that we didn't plant. Today, with what we know, I would even go so far as to plant it in the fence row because it is a pretty good native plant food. It gives us also both the smooth and the winged sumac gives us some really attractive fall color. It's consumed by a ton of animals, including the deer, which eat the fruit. Game birds include the quail, the ruffed, grouse, and the turkey utilize the fruit. Numerous species of songbirds, and here we'll cite the bluebirds, the gray catbirds, the ruby-crowned kinglets, and the others, again from citing Miller and Miller's book on forest plants of the southeast and their wildlife values. The most common species that we have here in the lower coastal plain is the winged sumac, but the smooth sumac, its range overlaps much of the longleaf pine, and in the staghorn, the natural range just barely comes into the mountains of North Georgia and the Carolinas, so there may be a little bit of overlap with the staghorn sumac. But the primary two species that we would have out there in the longleaf pine ecosystem would be the winged and the smooth. This is one that a lot of people complain about their herbicide site preparation if they have sumac coming back out there, but it's really hardly ever a species of concern in the long term of the native longleaf pine forest. It's very easy to keep these in place with frequent fire. They do provide some competition for young longleaf pine seedlings, but it's extremely rare to see them overtop and flat kill longleaf pine seedlings. So as soon as the trees get up and over the top of them, we can use fire to keep these right in check. And again, important seed producers for many of our species. The sumacs we tend to think about on the drier sites. Another seed producer that you're going to find down in wetter areas is the swamp Cyrilla, or also known as the tie-tie or the white tie-tie. This is the Cyrilla racemiflora. And in fire-excluded forest where they haven't burned for decades, this will turn into basically trees. In fact, Charles Dixon and Company is a large forest landowner, approximately 100,000 acres of land here in the southeast, and one of their foresters, Tom Savage, said he saw some tie-tie was so big that they ramped it up in a pulpwood harvest. But this is of interest to the Solon Dixon Center, again a 5,300 acre forest in lower Alabama. This used to be, it still is a natural longleaf and slash pine stand, but it used to have an incredible mid-story of tie-tie, and then they started using fire. Now we have a couple decades using frequent fire out in this forest, and that is basically a solid understory of tie-tie. Now there's a lot of native legumes, there's a lot of native blueberries and some native warm season grasses out there, but most of what you see is green in this photo is tie-tie, and it's kept in place by about a 2-year return interval on fire. Miller and Miller say that it's a preferred browse species with the new shoots when it comes up, but it keeps those leaves well into the winter. When it is, again, is an important browse species when there's not much else available for the white-tailed deer. Many pollinators use these flowers because it produces a prodigious amount of these finger-like racemes. In fact, we were doing some work down in the Ngozi plantation in the Florida Panhandle this spring, and the bee people took in semi-loads of bee colonies and placed them out to utilize mainly the tie-tie and the gallberry flowers this spring. If it does get out of hand, of course, the first choice is to utilize fire to keep it in place. But a Trifoliate is a herbicide that is commonly used on wet, waxy leaf species that we want to knock back in the longleaf pine ecosystem. The Trifoliate, you can target the gallberries, you can target the tie-ties, and it leaves most of the grasses in place. Another genus that produces some very valuable wildlife food plots is the viburnums or the haws. There's again a tremendous diversity in this genus, the viburnums. Some that grow on basically the driest upland sites, to some of them that grow down in the more mesic or very wet sites of the longleaf pine ecosystem. Three of the more common ones we're going to come across are possum haw, the Viburnum nudum, the Rusty Blackhaw, which is Viburnum retigulum, and the one that we see the most here on the Dixon Center is arrowwood, or the Viburnum dentatum, you find right out in these longleaf pine ecosystems. It's one that we can keep in place with fire. In fact, just about everything that's native to longleaf pine ecosystem can be kept in place if we use frequent fire. It's in the Caprifoliaceae, is the family. It's a fair to medium browse for deer. The winter fruit are utilized by the ruffed grouse, the turkey, the squirrel, rabbit, raccoon, and many songbirds. So it's a great one to keep out there. Let's switch gears a little bit, and again I'm going to borrow some slides here from Carol Denhoff, the understory coordinator with Longleaf Alliance. And a lot of people have, per the guidance of these books on how to manage for longleaf, for wildlife, some of them still have recommendations for planting Bermuda or Bahia, which is malpractice as far as I'm concerned. But these, although they work well as pasture grasses, they're not native, and they really provide some very, very poor wildlife habitat. From the point of a quail, the main problem is they're way too thick, so that the quail and the chicks cannot move through them. They're extremely competitive. They form these mats of grasses that outcompete the native vegetation. So generally, anywhere we're seeking to restore a longleaf pine ecosystem, if we have either of these two species in place, the Paspilum notatum, that's the Bahia grass, the Cyanodon dactylon is the Bermuda grass. We're going to want to target those for eradication before we go to any effort at getting the tree or the native species back out there. Interestingly, there are several native paspilums. I've seen Ernst Seed Company is working at bringing some of these into commercial production. I don't think there are no native species in this genus, which is the Bermuda grass. We're going to use exceptionally high rates of herbicides to control these. To get rid of the Bermuda grass in particular, you might apply rates as high as 64 ounces of imazapyr. That is the chopper rate, the lower active ingredient. If you was to put out a similar rate of arsenal AC, that would be equivalent to 32 ounces of the arsenal. If you have a mixed Bahia or Bermuda grass pasture, then you want to go ahead and use the imazapyr, because spraying Bahia with glyphosate releases any Bermuda that's in place. If you just have a pure Bahia grass pasture, then we've gotten fairly effective control using approximately 3 quarts to the acre of glyphosate. The common trade names on these are Roundup and Accord. And if we have a lot of blackberry out there, we're generally going to include Escort, which is metsulfuron, in that site preparation treatment. That is none of these three do we want to apply at high rates over the top of longleaf. You cannot apply glyphosate over longleaf at all, and you cannot apply metsulfuron over longleaf. That's why we want to get rid of these grasses before we plant. The most effective herbicides are very detrimental to the longleaf pine seedling. Tons of native alternatives are becoming available. Some are already available. Examples are some of the native panicum species or dicantheliums, the Indian grasses, the sergastrums. We're going to talk about 3 of them. The blue stems are the andropogons and the schizacriums, and the wiregrass, which is the most recognized of the native bunch grasses in the eastern portion of the range, from Alabama eastward, and then from Alabama westward, the longleaf pine understories would be dominated generally by the blue stems. Switchgrass is one of these native warm season grasses that is widely commercially available. Wildlife uses, seeds are consumed by the turkey, by quail, and by songbirds. One of the biggest benefits it provides is cover. It's a bunch grass again, so it allows quail to move through rather than the mats that are formed with Bermuda, the fescue, or the Bahia grass. And another big benefit excuse me, of using switchgrass is that it's going to allow us to carry fire through this forest. And if we can use fire, again, we can keep stuff like the hardwoods in places. We can keep too many oaks from evading, and just maybe keep some of our relatively fire-tolerant scrub oaks. There's 3 species of Sargastrum that are native to the lower coastal plain and much of the longleaf pine ecosystem. The most commonly cited one is the yellow Indian grass, or Sargastrum nutans. It also provides wildlife habitat in the form of that the seeds are utilized by birds and many mammals. And then it produces, again, the good habitat for the quail and the turkey, and allows us to carry fire through that forest. The 2 other species that we're also going to encounter are the Sargastrum secundum, which is the lopsided Indian grass. It's one of the most attractive, I think it's probably the most attractive bunch grass we have in the longleaf pine ecosystem. And a very neat one that a little more restricted range, but you find across the longleaf pine ecosystem, is Sargastrum iliata, or slender blue stem. And we're currently working with both Roundstone and the Porch Creek Indian tribe and establish some seed production areas this year, and hopefully going to have Sargastrum iliata available in the fairly near future. The little blue stem grows all across the native longleaf pine ecosystem. It used to be an Andropogon, but now it's just Acrium scoparium. It's also a component of the tall grass prairies and goes well up all the way to Canada as a native range. Great fire carrier. It's probably our dominant little blue stem here on the Solon-Dixon Center. And the seeds are consumed maybe sort of sparingly by songbirds and upland game birds. Aristida stricta, again, it's the species that dominated much of the eastern range of longleaf pine. It's not very good at recolonizing sites from which it's been eliminated. Anything that's been in agricultural previously, especially in the lower coastal plain, you're probably not going to see wiregrass coming back on its own. So it's very difficult and very expensive to get back out there. With all of these warm season grasses, we'd want to be very careful about how we do our site preparation. Most of them are going to be fairly tolerant of hexazinone, as long as we stay on the lower end rates on the sandy soils. So they've done some fairly good work down here on Eglin Air Force Base, looking at converting long-time fire-excluded stands that were dominated by scrub oaks back to the longleaf pine wiregrass ecosystem, and they was able to use hexazinone to take those oaks out of those stands, and in the long run they benefited both the wiregrass and the herbaceous layer in general. The seeds are used occasionally by songbirds, but really the 2 big things that wiregrass do for us is it provides good cover, and it gives us the ability to carry fire, especially across these very low nutrient xeric sand hills. It provides cover and forage also for the gopher tortoise. It's primarily being restored, I would say, using seed. We can do it for a few $100s an acre. We can get a pretty good stand of wiregrass back, drilling in the seed. It is commercially available. Some examples you might check into are Roundstone and Earth Seed Company. It's also done by using plugs. That gets fairly expensive, and it can run into several $1,000s an acre. You get basically an instant stand of wiregrass, but you have to have an awful lot of money to do that. Another species we touched briefly on in the first webinar was the Asian Lespedezas, in this case a Serratia, which is Lespedeza cuneata. This is really a problematic species that we have to deal with on a lot of sites that were used mine reclamation. Although it's not a real long-lived Lespedisa like the bicolor and Thunbergii, which are the invasive shrubs, it comes back from the seed basically forever. The seed just is very, very persistent. Some examples of herbicides that are recommended in Miller & Miller's control book. Garlon 4 is a 2% solution. These are all going to be foliar broadcast applications. Escort XP at a 3/4 ounce per acre, that's your metsulfuron. The Transline is fairly specific to your legumes at a 1/4% solution. Glyphosate is a 2% solution. And Velpar-L is your hexazinones. It's a 2% solution for control, spraying to wet. Mowing prior to herbicide can assist in the control measures. What are some good native alternatives? Two that are widely available commercially are your native partridge peas and your beggar's lice or desmodiums. The large flower partridge pea, we did a whole webinar associated with the problems of using large flower partridge pea in CRP plantings. I'll go over it just briefly here to point out both the good and the bad of this species. The seeds have long time been promoted, the large flower partridge pea, for bobwhite quail foods. You can go back and read Stoddard's book, and this is one the quail have been utilizing forever in the longleaf pine ecosystem. Also utilized by the wild turkey and small mammals. It's a moderate forage for deer, and a host plant for several species of butterflies. And the Latin name again is Chemacrista fasciculata, but you also see it referred to as Cassia fasciculata. This is the large flower over here on the left, and the small flower, very appropriately named, on the right. Generally, these were used in food plots. This is one of our native legumes that the very few that have been utilized in native food plots for a good period of time. You can buy it by the pound. That's how we're going to be putting it out there. This is a food plot on the Solon Dixon Center of large flower partridge pea that was last seeded over a decade ago, and we haven't put seed back out there. Just light strip disking stimulates the seed. Also fire stimulates the seed, and it comes back. It produces a ton of seed for the quail, the turkey, and this is especially utilized in the fall and winter months. But it can make a terrible species to include where you're establishing longleaf, especially through conservation reserve programs. And large flower partridge pea was included in especially one called the lark selection, which is a fairly aggressive one developed or utilized in food plots where it does a good job in the food plot. But this is the first growing season on a longleaf pine planting in Covenant County, Alabama, and in this case it's dominated the entire site. And if they had not taken remedial measures, they would have lost that planting. This is a site over in Geneva County, Alabama, that was planted to longleaf. They had 90% survival of longleaf at the end of the first growing season, but lost most all of the trees by end of the third growing season because it was dominated by large flower partridge pea. And what happened is they covered up the tree. They've removed them in this case, but the longleaf is already dead. These two are dead. This one survived. And that allowed for very warm, moist conditions that a fungus called Rhizoctonia then attacked the trees and killed the longleaf. So you need to be very careful about including large flower partridge pea where we're trying to establish longleaf. Another exotic species that has been promoted, continues to be promoted in some food plot books, is called hemp sesbania or Sesbania exalta. It's also an Asian exotic, which is very rarely proves to be a wise idea to plant something from Asia. It can be especially invasive. You're going to often see it on wet road shoulders, which is where this photo was taken, on a road shoulder, and ruderal sites, and it can be a very problematic species in agronomic situations. This is hemp sesbania coming up in peanuts, but it's a problem in several of our agronomic crops. Instead of the hemp sesbania, one you may want to consider, a very good genus, is the native desmodiums. One that has been brought into production, already commercially available, is Desmodium floridanum, or Florida tick trefoil. It's a long-lived perennial, so once you establish it, it's going to be there. If you maintain it with fire, probably for the rest of your life, it'll be there. It is a high preference deer forage, as are several species in the Desmodium genus, or the beggar's lice genus. The seeds are utilized by the bobwhite quail, turkey, dove, small mammals, and several other songbirds. Roundstone is working with Lolly Creek to bring this one in production in South Georgia. I think pretty sure that Arndt Seed Company has several other species of Desmodiums, any of which would be a fantastic alternative. That would provide at least some browse during the summer months. It's not going to be browsed that much in the winter months, but the seed is going to persist well into the fall and winter months, where it's going to be utilized by a lot of game birds. Another one that some people have looked at, even thought of as a potential utilization for silvopasture settings, is Desmodium paniculatum. This is another native. As far as I know, all of the native Desmodiums are fairly long-lived perennial species. The only introduced Desmodium that I know of is Desmodium tortuosum, and it's an annual. It's also a very persistent problem in agronomic situations. But these native Desmodiums have never been shown to be problematic competitors in agricultural fields. And the Desmodium paniculatum in particular is very widespread across much of the longleaf pine range, and it's a fairly shade-tolerant species. We often find this in mixed pine hardwood stands that have been fire excluded for long periods of time. This one will persist. So that tends to indicate this may be a good one to utilize in early restoration in fairly dense longleaf pine stands. If you was going to go into, for instance, an established CRP planting, longleaf will get crown closure and shade out your native species almost as bad as loblolly or slash pine on these agricultural sites if you get a good 400 or 500 stems per acre. This might be one species we could come back in and utilize to get some native forage and seed production back in these native longleaf forests that have been severely depleted of ground cover. Two other really good again, guides that we would refer you to. Two of the best I've seen using photos, so you don't have to know how to work through a botanical key. A field guide to the common legume species of the longleaf pine ecosystem. This was produced by the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center, Heather Norden and Kay Kirkman, with funding from Roundstone Seed Company and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Georgia Native Plant Society. So this is a fantastic one for the native legumes. They also produce a great one, probably the best I've seen as far as the quality of the photos and the plant descriptions, on the Field and Restoration Guide to Common Native Warm Season Grasses of the Longleaf Pine Ecosystem by Melanie Kaiser and Kay Kirkman. Most everything that we discussed today, most all of these plants and outlined as native alternatives are available from various nurseries. We didn't identify them, plant to specific nurseries we was going to, but we are providing a list of nurseries here at the end. These are also, almost every one of these are from our longleaf nursery list, so they also provide longleaf pine seedlings, with the exception of the seed companies such as Roundstone Seed, which is one of the Roundstone and Ernst, and also the southern habitats. They're the three leaders among the plant companies in getting our native species back into commercial production and getting these back out to where we can restore our native habitats. The Branchula orchidia in Florida is one of the very few that we've seen producing a large numbers of native vacciniums, the blueberries and the huckleberries. The state forestry commissions, those that remain in existence, oftentimes have switched over from growing invasive shrubs such as the bicolor and the thunbergii, the Elaeagnus that we don't want out there. They're doing a really good job of switching over to native alternatives. some other sources commercially. Aubergine has some fantastic selection of native viburnums. Again, Ernst Seed Company has got a large-scale restoration project going in around Live Oak, Florida, where they're bringing in some of the native paspalums and desmodiums and lespedizes into production. The Florida Association of Native Plants, if it grows in Florida, then you can find some nurseries that produce it through their website. Georgia Forestry Commission, really want to give them acknowledgement for bringing in one of my favorites is Lespedeza hirta, is available as a bare root plant. Louisiana State Forestry Commission is starting to do some good work. Just recently switched over to growing container grown longleaf. And the North Carolina Forest Service also has some of the native Lespedezas available. And I believe that gets us to the presentation. I'd be more than happy to take some questions at this time. And Sarah, you want to jump in?
Yes. If anybody has questions, please go ahead and type it into the chat box. And we'll stay on here for a few minutes to answer questions, and then I will push out your redirect URL that will take you to the quiz and satisfaction survey. Any questions?
Also, I would like to mention that I received a few emails from some people who attended last week's webinar, and I've been booked up and haven't replied to any yet. But anybody that would like to email me directly with questions, I'm going to be catching up on my email over the coming week. You can email me at mark@longleafalliance.org. And Eric G., where can you get wiregrass seeds in North Carolina? Well, I know that Roundstone Seed and Company is selling wiregrass. I tend to think that's going to be from South Georgia and Florida seed sources. They've also done some collections possibly in lower Alabama. Wiregrass, I know the South Carolina Forestry Commission was doing some work and we're growing the plugs. I would check with also T.J. Savarino and with Clemson University, and they have a native plant program that is tracking everything that's available. Also, I'll tell you, this is the best email, carol@longleafalliance.org. She is our understory coordinator, Carol Denhoff, and it's her job to keep track of everybody that is providing both the seeds and the plants for sale. So I would drop Carol an email and ask her who is producing wiregrass for seed in North Carolina.
All right, any more questions? If not, I will go ahead and push the URL out to you. Just a quick reminder that you need to have been on here for 49 minutes to get your CFEs. So I'll hang around for just a few more minutes to make sure everybody can get their CFEs that need them. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, the CFE URL should be pushing through your main screen, but also there's a link to it in the chat box.